This is a continuation of the sequel to our Topolino road trip to Istanbul. The taxi took us to the old town area of Damascus, near the souk. We found a hotel nearby, not very good, but cheap. I started to feel seriously ill. High temperature, vomiting and diarrhoea. Ros said I looked purple. There was only one toilet on our corridor, so my frequent visits got me into heated arguments with a voluble woman in a head-to-toe covering. The symptoms were like cholera, but we'd had inoculations against that, so we suspected food poisoning from the previous day, presumably due to my weakened state, owing to the tonsillitis. Ros managed to get a doctor, but he didn't speak English. Fortunately, a couple of visitors did. There were lots of Indians and Pakistanis in the hotel, and half of them seemed to hang around the door to watch. The doctor said it was probably the change of food or too much sun, but gave me some tablets that he said would stimulate my heart. He didn't inspire our confidence. The next day I was not much better, but on Tuesday the 19th of July I began to make a recovery. I was very weak, but managed to walk to a nearby cafe. Someone had made unkind translations of their menu, and they'd included it. Ros made a note. It read, hen water soup, lady's thigh, lamb liver rapish up, perhaps they meant wrapped up, cigarette pie, special curdled milk, stuffed intestines, and brain salad. I managed some yoghurt, and Ros some shish kebab. The following day Ros went out for a look around by herself. On the Thursday we decided to move on from Damascus and took a taxi to Amman. Again it was very cheap. There was no problem getting Jordanian visas at the border. We didn't spend long in Amman, and eager to get to Jerusalem, eventually took another inexpensive taxi. It was an enjoyable journey, Mars-scaped desert, and we passed near to the Dead Sea, which we were told was the lowest point on earth. As the sun began to set, we climbed the hill to Jerusalem and arrived near the bus station. We soon found a cheap hotel. Our note said it had very comfortable beds, but was a shared room. Surprisingly, we don't remember any other occupants. On the Friday, 22nd of July, we felt at our best for some time, so during the morning explored the old town and visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Jaffa Gate. Lunchtime we lashed out and paid 5 shillings each for a good meal. In the afternoon we bought an airmail version of the Times and sat down to read it. A Jordanian guy next to us read it over my shoulder. Eventually he said he didn't think much of it because there was no picture of King Hussein. He explained that their newspapers always had such a picture. Later we returned to the hotel and talked to an American girl with an English guy who just returned from Petra. Our funds were getting a bit low, so we decided to leave Petra for another time. Finally, using our petrol stove, we cooked a meal of rice, frankfurters and beans, our first full day for some time. Saturday we were up early and went to the British consulate to find out about crossing into Israel. Our next stop was the Archaeological Museum, which was first class, so we stayed until it closed. On the way back to our hotel we bumped into an American guy with a BSA motorcycle. Before I met Ros, I'd spent all my money on motorbikes, so this was interesting for me. This photo shows one of my motorbikes, a Velocep Venom Clubman. Amazingly, in 2025, a Venom Clubman still holds a world speed record, as the only 500cc motorbike to have averaged over 100 miles an hour for 24 hours. This was established in Montlhéry, France in 1961, a fact that had induced me to buy one. However, enough of motorcycle nostalgia and back to the story. Sunday we decided to get a bus to Bethlehem. On the way to the bus station we came across Tony, who we'd met in Istanbul. He invited us to visit him later at the British School of Archaeology. We were not very impressed with Bethlehem, so soon returned to our hotel for a siesta. In the afternoon we went to the British consulate to find out where the School of Archaeology was and got a telephone number. We rang Tony and walked to the school. It was very British, with a Land Rover and a donkey in the garden. The donkey was of course called Eeyore, after the A.A. Milne character. This illustration was drawn by E.H. Shepard, who illustrated the books. Tony had a very good room, and hanging up was an embroidered Afghan coat, the first that we had seen. He wouldn't tell us his surname, so it was presumably from a well-known family. He was very pro-Arab and talked a lot about the Israel-Palestine problem. We decided to reserve our judgment. In 2003, the name of the institute was changed to the Kenyon Institute, after the archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. The building was an attractive Ottoman villa behind a large blue gate, but due to trees cannot be seen from the road. Later, sitting on a wall by the Damascus gate, we were invited by a couple of youths to visit their house. They took us in their long-wheelbase Land Rover, and on the way we visited the Mount of Olives. The following day, Monday the 25th of July, I went to the government office to delay our departure into Israel for a day, since we'd been persuaded that they would take us to the Dead Sea for a swim. This never actually happened, but they gave us a local tour anyway. We'd enjoyed our stay in Jordan. Everyone was very friendly, and we had lots of invitations to sit down and have a glass of tea. Tuesday we paid our hotel and walked to the Mandelbaum Gate, which was the only crossing point into Israel. In this photo, the nuns have special permission to travel from Israel to Jordan to visit the Holy Sepulchre. This map shows the area before and after the 1967 Six-Day War. After the war, the crossing was dismantled. As we left, a Jordanian shouted, "Good luck!" Once our passports had an Israeli stamp, there was no going back into an Arab country. We saw our first Hasidic Jews. They looked so repulsive that Ros did a sketch in our logbook. A typical example had a wide-brimmed black hat, below which hung a pair of ringlets either side of a deathly pale face, and an open-necked white shirt, square-shouldered, long, double-breasted coat, baggy too-short black trousers, exposing bare legs and dirty tennis shoes. Giving them a smile was met with averted eyes, or a particular interest in the ground. We took a bus to Tel Aviv. On the way we passed lots of young people in the uniform of their military service and kibbutz farming communities. Tel Aviv didn't hold our interest for long and was surprisingly dirty. Eventually we took a bus to Haifa to find out about boats to Turkey. To make things easier, we decided to leave our rucksacks in the left luggage. Having gone only a few steps, I realised I'd left our street map in a side pocket. I asked the guy behind the counter if he could please retrieve my map. The rucksack was only a couple of feet from his elbow. He was extremely unpleasant and said that we would have to book the rucksack out and then pay again to leave it. We were rather shocked. In the countries we'd been travelling in, the request would be met with a smile, a small boy would be sent out for glasses of tea, and there would be a chat about one of their relations, studying in England or some such. I asked to see the manager and explained about our unreasonable treatment. He was even more unpleasant. We realised that this was the only unkind encounter that we'd had on the whole trip, not a good entry into the country. Our first purchase was a postcard of Haifa, with the Shrine of the Bab on it. There's some of the history of the Bab in our earlier video. Without the map, we found our way to the harbour and inquired about boats to Turkey. We were shocked to find out that they were all booked up until September. We retreated, and having eaten a rather expensive but poor lunch, looked for a cheap hotel. Again, this was a problem. They were all too expensive for us, so we decided to retrieve our rucksacks and sleep in a nearby park. As it started to get dark, the rats came out, looking for the day's discarded scraps. We found a couple of adjacent benches and tried to chase the rats away with stones. As soon as it was pitch dark, we got into our sleeping bags. In the middle of the night, we heard someone walking around the park. We couldn't see them, but we could see the bright spot at the end of their cigarette. Luckily, they didn't try to sit on us, and they eventually left. At about 5 a.m, the flies drove us out, and we decided to try again in the port. It turned out that there was a ferry leaving at 7:30 a.m. Thursday on a route Haifa, Cyprus, Piraeus, Brindisi. We knew there had been some disturbances in Cyprus, so we went to the British consulate to find out about the situation. They told us that the ship would call in at Limassol. However, we would need a minimum of £50 each to enter the country. After counting up all our money, we returned to the port and bought deck-class tickets for Cyprus, leaving us very close to £100. A hotel was out of the question, so it would have to be the park benches again. Unlike the Arab countries, we were not met with friendly faces, or anyone wanting to chat, and with no money to spend, we eventually found our way to the railway station. There we came across an English guy who we'd seen in the park. He said that he was waiting for some money to come from England, but in the meantime had sold blood for a few pounds. Leaving Roz with the rucksacks, I set out and managed to find some cheap end-of-day eatables in a small cake shop. Once it was dark, we returned to our park benches. Thursday, the flies encouraged another early start. In the port, the departure had been revised to 9 a.m, and eventually, at 10:15, aboard the SS Kypros, a 1932 ship built in Norway, we began to nose out of the harbour. We weren't sorry to leave Israel. We'd entered the country with open minds. In all the previous countries we travelled through, we were met with cheerful friendliness. Here our smiles were greeted with stony indifference, and several times we'd been subjected to unkindness and rudeness. The journey to Cyprus was uneventful, but at Limassol confusion reigned. The harbour was too shallow for the Kypros, so passengers were transferred in small boats. For some reason we were not on the list. I walked to the empty purser's office and found our passports lying among others on a table. There was lots of shouting, none of it in English, but luckily we found an English girl married to a Cypriot. They also wanted to get off, so we just followed them. At the entry point, the police asked us about the £50. I explained that it was sewn into my clothing for security, but could be retrieved if they needed to see it. They then asked us how long we wanted to stay. "Until we can get a boat to Turkey," was our reply. They stamped our passports. "There's a ship, the Adriatica, leaving tomorrow for Izmir. You can leave on that," they said. A taxi took us to a hotel, $1 each. It was quite good, and a very motherly woman looked after us and cooked us good omelettes. We realised that she was the first motherly woman that we'd seen since leaving Europe. In preparation of this video, I looked up the Kypros on the internet. In an Israeli archive, I discovered that later that year she had turned up in Haifa on fire. All the occupants were rescued, but after valiant efforts by the Israeli fire service, the poor old Kypros had to be beached and became a total wreck. In the morning we walked along the seafront, and somewhere found a postcard of Famagusta. We didn't visit Famagusta, but since it was an attractive card, I'm including it. The Adriatica was a bigger and much better ship. We walked all over it before discovering that as tourist class we were restricted to a small area and not considered cultured enough to use the library. We smuggled ourselves into the second-class lounge and shared an expensive bottle of Coca-Cola. Separate cabins in segregated areas were provided, but when night approached, we found a secluded area and slept on the floor in our sleeping bags. Saturday we reached Rhodes and were ferried across to do the touristical bit. This is one of the ferries, and this photo shows the Adriatica. To our surprise, we saw several Topolinos. Unfortunately, we didn't take a photo of one, but the town was very attractive. We saw some Americans that we'd met in Jerusalem, and Roz spotted a girl she'd known at school. She was looking very first class, so we decided not to cause embarrassment by accosting her. It was very warm, so that night we slept on the deck in our sleeping bags. In the morning we had a good view of the islands. The ship was supposed to land at Izmir, but for some reason we were put off at Kustasi. The disembarkation was very disorganised, and we were very lucky to find our passports abandoned in the first-class lounge. However, a free bus was provided to take us to Izmir. The road had been sprayed with tar, and the bus became plastered with it. In Izmir, the money changers surrounded us, but the ratio was not as good as in Istanbul. We took a taxi and found a cheap hotel. They wanted 10 Turkish lira, but we negotiated it down to 9. The washing facilities are a bit primitive, but we decided to stay. A very friendly guy paid for our taxi and bought us a couple of gazoz drinks. We were certainly not in Israel. There were several antique junk shops, and we bought a silver case pocket watch. It didn't work and had only one hand, but the dial was in very good condition and had attractive Arabic numerals. It was marked Smyrna, which is the previous Greek name for Izmir. To avoid getting ill, we bought a meal in a quite smart restaurant. Later we bought a large melon and made pigs of ourselves, getting very sticky in the process. While washing ourselves off in a fountain, a couple of guys introduced themselves and wanted to talk about the World Cup. Unfortunately not our thing. There was an amusement park. We went for a ride on a small train. There was also a zoo. However, people were being unkind to the animals and throwing stones at them, so we soon left. After a samovar of tea, we returned to the hotel. On Monday the 1st of August we got a bus headed for Bursa. It travelled on a narrow road close to the sea, and we saw some saltwater ducks. On the way the bus broke down due to brake trouble. Luckily it had not been a mountain route. After an hour or two it was fixed. In Bursa the stop was surrounded by money changers again, and offers of cheap hotels, but we struck off into the town. Eventually we found a quite good hotel for not too much money, and the following day we started to explore Bursa. It was a pleasant town at the foot of a mountain. In one antique shop we were befriended by the owner, called Rafet. He didn't seem to bother that we weren't going to buy anything, but showed us some of his treasure that he had tucked away. For several years afterwards he sent us postcards. Rafet said we shouldn't leave Bursa without taking the cable car to the top of the mountain. So despite my fear of cable cars and a tendency to vertigo, we bought tickets. The cable ran fairly close to the ground, so it wasn't too scary. At the top there was snow, and it looked similar to the Alps. After a couple of days we got a bus back to Kadikoy. On the way it stopped at several villages to drop people off. The terminus was close to the Hyderpasha railway station. This made it convenient for a ferry across the Bosphorus to Kabatash, the busy waterfront area of Beyoğlu. We then walked up the hill to my friend Julian's flat, and the end of this stage of our journey. A couple of days were spent recovering, eating meals that we were not frightened of, and doing some more sightseeing. We visited the Hagia Sophia. This edifice has had a checkered career. It was built as a Christian church in the 6th century, between 532 and 537, during the rule of the then Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. This was on the site of a pagan temple and a number of previous churches, destroyed by fire and insurrections. After the Turkish conquest of Constantinople in 1453, it was repurposed as a mosque. In 1934, Kemal Ataturk secularized the building and turned it into a museum. However, in 2020, Erdogan has had it converted back into a mosque. Next on our list was the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent. This was built in the 16th century and designed by the famous Ottoman imperial architect Sinan, who lived from 1520 to 1566. It was, however, based on the design of the Hagia Sophia. Our last large mosque was the Blue Mosque. This huge structure, with its 6 minarets rather than usual 4, was built in the 17th century, 1609 to 1616. Its popular name comes from the colour of much of the interior tile decoration. However, it's properly known as the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, named after Sultan Ahmed I, who who ordered its construction. The following day we visited the Topkapi Palace and Harem. This was initially built in the 15th century by order of Sultan Mehmed II, but was rebuilt and renovated many times. After the end of the Sultanate in 1922, it was converted into a museum. However, the Galata Bridge was the interesting centre of activity, especially the spice market end. This aerial view gives a good idea of Istanbul in the 1960s. No high-rise blocks or suspension bridges. The next consideration was how to get back to England. The bill for customs bond had become quite high, and given the state of the Topolino, and that even if we got it home it wasn't taxed and would require a lot of repairs that we couldn't afford, we came to the conclusion that we'd better to abandon it and return on the train. In those pre-computer days there was little risk of a customs bill chasing us, and due to our visit to Israel we would have to change our passports anyway. Subsequent visits proved this to be the case. A contact paid for our train tickets in Turkish lira, and we refunded him in US dollars, which made it advantageous for both of us. Our return to England and what happened to us there is explained in part 3 of our previous video. So this brings us to the end of our Topolino trip, which was the genesis of a whole series of other travels in eastern Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan and Morocco, plus numerous road trips in Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Soviet Union and the USA. Au revoir.